Hello, hello, everyone. I'm Jay, and I'll be covering introduction to Photoshop today. So there's a variety of things that I'm going to be spending a lot of time in Photoshop itself on the screen share. Um, but to begin with, I want to do a quick intro to the kind of ideas that we're utilizing for schematic design. So let me share that screen. So I'm borrowing some older slides here. The thing that I really want to make clear about the way we're utilizing Photoshop is this is a tool for schematic design. And for IP1, that's the focus here is schematic design. So the idea is that you're mocking up a concept, and the work you do in Photoshop will be focused on illustrating that concept effectively, not necessarily creating like highly photorealistic renders of a design. That's something we can get to later in either AGI 32 or Revit. So the idea is that we can quickly communicate design concepts using Photoshop by placing the idea of light, and you can use gradients and solid beams like this to illustrate the concept without actually doing a highly realistic representation. Um, and you can draw from existing photos of light sources and insert them into your photos to create a representation of the idea. But again, the focus is not on equipment, but rather concepts. So the focus is on the light itself, not the gear we're using to get there. That'll come later. So um, let's uh, let's jump right into Photoshop. So if you click the link I put in the chat, you can grab the outline that I'm going to be working from today. And I just want to cover some basic concepts and tools. A lot of this is going to be fairly remedial to those of you that are already familiar with Photoshop and comfortable in Photoshop, but I want to make sure to cover the bases so that we're not leaving anyone behind. Here's a photo I selected that we'll be utilizing throughout. You can also download this photo from the class page as well as the outline. So some super basics here. So this is our work area, and the top here you have your menu bar, and so the main thing you're going to need up here is your save tools as well as your exporting tools. So here's how you can export your images from Photoshop. So if you just want something immediately, quick export as PNG is the fastest way to get something out of Photoshop. But you can also use the export dialog box to get a more efficient file size. So we have the toolbar along the left side here. And these are all your common editing tools that are most heavily utilized. And you can customize this toolbar, but for the most part, it's providing you the basics that you're going to need. So when you select a tool, you can hover over it, and especially the new the newest version of Photoshop, you can see that it gives you like a quick little video demo of what that is, including the keyboard shortcut. So that's really handy if you're not familiar with some of these tools yet. You can also right click each of these buttons, and each button is actually a whole family of tools, as you can see here. So, for example, the marquee family includes rectangular marquee, elliptical, and rows. So when you select a tool, you'll see up here your option bar is going to change and display the options for your selected tool. So that's going to allow you to modify that tool to suit your specific needs at the moment. And then finally, over here, we have our panel selection. And so the most important thing here is going to be our layers. So if you don't see the layers, oftentimes if you over here in an adjustment, your layers can minimize or skip over to these other tabs, but here's the layers tab right here. And this is the main thing that we're going to utilize heavily throughout. And this is especially useful for schematic design because it allows you to place your different concepts on different layers and easily toggle them on and off. Okay, so a couple quick things on your view options. So unlike basically every other program ever made, control and mouse wheel does not zoom in Photoshop. So it's a good thing to remember. It's going to be alt and mouse wheel gets you your zoom in and zoom out, or zoom to cursor specifically. For Mac users, that's going to be option and mouse wheel. So one nice shortcut when you're wanting to get back out is Control 0, or for Mac user Command 0, and that's just zoom to fit. So that'll get you back out to your overall view so you can quickly dive in and out of your image. Pan, you just need to hold the space bar and you'll see that gives me the hand icon for my cursor, and that allows me to pan around, especially when you're zoomed in, so I can take a look at the individual elements here. So holding spacebar and then just clicking and dragging gets you your pan. And then one thing that I found out in my my preparation for this class, which blew my mind because I've needed this for years, caps lock gives you the crosshairs here. So there's plenty of tools where you get an icon. So like the magic wand selector. But where is that actually clicking? If you're zoomed way in and trying to grab like the bottom of this pipe organ here, it's unclear exactly which pixel that button is landing on. So if you press caps lock, it's going to trade that image for a crosshairs. It's still the same tool, but now you have the crosshair so you know exactly which pixel you're clicking on. Undo, which so some of you may be familiar with older versions of Photoshop. Undo was a bit sideways in older versions of Photoshop. Specifically, Control Z was just undoing one step and redoing that same step. In the latest version of Photoshop, so in other words, if you just downloaded Photoshop via the Penn State Software Store using Creative Cloud, Control Z will walk you back through multiple steps. To redo, all you need to do is press Control Shift Z for redo, and that'll be multiple redo, just like you would expect in any other program. For Mac users, of course, that's Command Z for undo and Command Shift Z for redo. So this change took place in October 2018. So the newer versions of Photoshop are all using the more typical version of undo and redo that you might expect. Okay, so selections. Selections are the foundation of how we operate in Photoshop, and the selection tools give you a lot of really solid options depending on what you're looking to do. So we'll start with just the basic marquee tool, and so specifically the rectangular marquee. So there's nothing exciting about this. This is your super basic selection tool like you would see in almost any program. It's just going to give you a box, and everything in the box is selected. So while we're here, I want to highlight these buttons right here, which are the type of selecting you're doing. So the default option is just new selection. So every time I click and drag that box, it'll give me a new separate selection. Now, it's really common that you might want to be selecting multiple things at the same time. So you can do that by clicking this button here, which is just add to selection. So when that option is selected, every time I click and drag, it's going to add the selection. So that way I can select multiple elements at the same time. Similarly, subtract selection is the same idea, but whenever I use that, it's going to remove the selected area that intersects. So that's also really helpful if you've over selected, for example. And then finally, you have the intersect selection tool, which is similar, but what you're doing with the intersect selection tool is you're only selecting the elements that are common to both selections, as you can see there. So it's subtractive, but not a straight subtraction. So another thing that you might want to do, for example, if we are selecting, say, this window, and I'm wanting to, wanting no pixels are selected. Yep. See, and that's why you need to have the right selection option. So, so let's say I'm trying to preserve this window, and remove the things around it, right? So I'll just make a layer here so we can look at just this window. So let's say I'm trying to preserve this window, but remove these elements up here. I can make a selection on the window. But if I'm trying to remove this top and bottom piece, I have the wrong selection, right? So I can right click on my selection with the select tool still enabled, and I can select inverse, which means I'm selecting everything but my original selection, which in this case is going to give me the ability to erase those top and bottom pieces. So inverse selection is a particularly powerful tool because oftentimes it's much easier to select the things you do want than the things you don't, or vice versa. Now, when I'm done with my selection, I can deselect. So I can, with the selection tool enabled, mind you. So when I'm in the eraser, see that same context menu is not available. This is now the eraser context menu. So if I go back to my selection tool, I can deselect, but probably faster because you're going to be selecting and deselecting all the time is the keyboard shortcut Control D, which will deselect it immediately. And that's Command D for Mac users. So the rectangular marquee tool leaves a lot to be desired. So let's take a look at some of the more robust selection tools. I want to start here with the smart selection options. And within that, the two that I use the most are the magic wand and the object selection tool. So let's start with the object selection tool. Again, looking at this window here. So what this is doing is asking Photoshop to recognize objects, and you're just going to draw a box around this window. and it attempted to single out that object. So the window is maybe not a great example here because it's not particularly high contrast. And so these kind of smart selection tools work best when you have clear edges or high contrast differences between your zones. So let's instead look at these acoustic tiles here and ask it to select an acoustic tile for me. Oop, sorry, I'm on an empty layer. That's why. So let's see if it can grab this acoustic tile for me. And you can see it grabbed that particular shape. And this is nice because I don't have to have exactly that shape. I can just select the area and ask Photoshop to figure out what I'm looking for. So again, you have the same options here where you can add and subtract. So let's go with add and grab the acoustic tile next to it. Now we have a pair. So something that is important to point out here is the selection mode. So right now I'm in rectangular selection mode, which means I can only draw a rectangle. Oftentimes, if for more abstract shapes, the lasso tool is going to be more useful. So we can use the lasso tool to draw an arbitrary shape, say around that sconce in the chandelier. Great. And it did a pretty solid job there. Okay, but let's clean this up down at the bottom because it grabbed a little more than I really wanted. So let's go back to the rectangular marquee tool, go to subtract selection, and just have it flatten out that bottom. Now I've got a nice clean shape that I can modify directly without changing the base underneath it. Okay, so the other tool that you're likely to heavily utilize is the magic wand. The magic wand tool is great for selecting very arbitrary shapes based purely on the similarity between the pixels. So a couple details on that. First off, we want to look at the sample size here. So if you have it on point sample, it means the reference for what it's trying to select is a single pixel. That can be helpful sometimes, and sometimes it can be problematic. So for example, down here, if I'm wanting to select this washed out window here, then a point sample is going to be highly effective because I can select any point and it's going to grab everything similar. Okay, but it didn't grab the centerpiece here. I could add that to the selection, but a lot of times that's not really the correct choice. In this case, it would be an easy solution. But let's try increasing the tolerance instead to see if we can grab that whole section. Looks like I increased the tolerance too far. So the tolerance up here is going to change how similar the pixels need to be for the magic wand tool to grab those pixels as well. All right, one more selection tool, the lasso tool. So the basic lasso tool, and right now I'm just using a mouse. I have a pen tablet, but I'm not utilizing that right now. So the basic lasso tool is most useful when you have a pen tablet or a touch screen of some sort because it's a free drawn line. So it's really difficult to get that right with the mouse. So yeah, that kind of got the shape, but that's not really what I'm looking for. So if you have a pen, the lasso tool is a really solid choice. However, since I don't have a pen, let's go with the polygonal lasso tool instead. So the polygonal lasso tool is helpful because it allows me to get straight lines. So I can just click and get the straight lines along that edge exactly as I would expect. Okay, now I screwed up. Do I have to restart? Good news, you don't. The delete key will remove the most recent point. You keep hitting the delete key, you can keep removing points until you get back to where you want to be. So the delete key is really helpful with these multi-point selection tools. Now, let's say I want to close it. So I can either click the start of my line, and you can see how my cursor changed and it gave me the circle that's showing me it's going to close the loop. Another solution is simply double clicking on the last point I'm interested in. So double clicking will draw a straight line from wherever you double click to the start of your loop and close that loop to make your selection. So the polygonal lasso tool was helpful there, but we also have the magnetic lasso tool, which I'm a big fan of because it can pick those edges out for you. And so for a clearly defined shape, it's not terribly helpful. So let's go look for a more abstract shape. How about the piano? In order to get this curve here, the polygonal lasso tool is going to be really time consuming to use. So the magnetic lasso tool is a much better option here because it can adapt to the curve automatically. So all I need to do is pick my starting point, and you can see that it grabs onto the edge of that piano. Now, I can force it to use points, which is helpful when it seems to be lost. Just not doing too good of a job right now. I think my width is too high. Let's start over. There we go. Now it's grabbing the edge of that piano much better. So to get changes in direction, I'll probably want to click the points, but you can see if I keep going that the polygonal lasso tool grabs those points on its own and just adds them as I go along. And again, I can just double click to close this loop. There I have the top of the piano selected. So the magnetic lasso tool is particularly useful for curves. The rectangular lasso tool is particularly useful for straight lines. Now, that's especially important because light moves in straight lines. So if you're wanting to clearly define a beam of light, the polygonal lasso tool is probably the way to go. If you're trying to get an arbitrary shape like the top of that piano, the magnetic lasso tool is more helpful. So the last thing I want to point out is the main reason we're using these selection tools is to create layers. And so, for example, I'm going to grab this window over here, and I'll use the polygonal lasso tool to do so. So now I've selected this window. So I want to create a layer with this window so I can modify the window. So I can just right click and select layer via copy or layer via cut. Typically, you want to go with layer via copy. simply because when you modify it, it allows you to quickly revert to the original. So that's how we can get separate layers. Say we want to highlight that chandelier and grab all of those sconces in the chandelier. We can select select each light and add the selections to build up the whole selection, create a layer via copy, and then we can modify that to give the impression of that chandelier emitting light, for example. Let's talk about the layer tools. So we have the layers down here in this section. So the basic thing is just creating a new layer. So you can do that using the plus right here. That'll add a layer. Or the keyboard shortcut is Control Shift N, and that's going to create a layer with the layer dialog box. So typically, if you're creating a modification, if you're just painting on top of your image, what you want to do is place those changes on a new layer rather than placing it directly on the background, because that actually changes the original pixels. And the only way to recover that is to undo everything you've done since then. So it's far easier to instead make your changes on a new layer and just overlay what is already there on the background. You can easily rename a layer. All you need to do is double click the layer name. Let's see. I think that's the window. Nope, layer 2 is the window. Okay, so I'm gonna rename that to window, and all you need to do is double click the layer name directly. Orderly naming helps keep you sane because you can quickly accumulate dozens and dozens of layers in Photoshop. So you probably just saw me use the hide feature. So you can show or hide a layer simply by clicking the eye next to it. So that's a quick, easy way to cycle through your changes. Which is especially useful for IP1 because that's explicitly a requirement in IP1. You can also reorder. So all you need to do to reorder is click and drag. So let's say on the test layer, we wanted to light these windows up. So that's not too effective. Let's try the polygonal lasso tool instead. So there I have my window, and I'll just use the paint bucket tool to paint it in. Let's pick ourselves a nice yellow. Pretend this is warm white. So now I've actually I placed that on the window layer. Let's undo that. So instead of painting directly on that window, what I want to do is place it here on the test layer, and we'll call this window lights. So there I've added light, at least schematically, to the window. So I can remove that easily, or if I reorder this, notice that it's gone now. It's not gone, it's just underneath that layer. And so if we hide the window, you can see that patch is still there. So this gives you your hierarchy of layers, which is important. because the layers highest up in your list are going to overlay anything lower down in the list. Similarly, when you use adjustment layers or layers that are not 100% opaque, you'll be modifying all of the layers below it. So let's talk about the adjustment layer. So I want to get that selection back. So let's say I just want to brighten this up. We can go to adjustments here. This is this adjustment tab. So I want to modify that window pane specifically, and I just want to brighten it up. So I can go to the adjustments, increase the brightness. Oh, look, looks like we have sunlight coming through the window. That's convenient. So now this adjustment layer will modify all of the layers below it, which means when I remove that window, it's still going to be brightening up this patch of wall behind it, or the window light, as you can see. So let's remove that adjustment layer. We'll start with just the window light. So there's the patch of yellow. I'll add the adjustment layer back to that. Now it brightened the yellow because it's brightening all of the things underneath it, right? And if I add the window back in, you can see that the yellow is blacked out because the window layer is covering the window light layer, but it's still being brightened by the adjustment layer above it. Similarly, if I move this adjustment layer down, give ourselves a little more room to see those. If I move that adjustment layer down, now it's underneath the window and only adjusting the layers underneath, but it's being covered up by the 100% opaque window layer. So this is how your hierarchy works and how you can cover up things or add things easily just by reordering your layers. Okay, so let's bring that back above the window layer. And let's say I'm happy with that window. So let's just leave it as is. And I'm never going to change it again. So we can select both of these. I just control selected that. I right click it and you can merge these layers together. So now I have one layer, unfortunately called brightness contrast. So let's rename that to window again. And as you can see, now that brightness contrast change was merged into the window layer and changed the actual pixels of the window layer permanently. All right, quick introduction to some other tools. So you can see this one I've been using throughout. This is your move tool. So you can grab your sub layers. You can't grab your background because typically your background is going to be locked. You can see the lock icon right there. If I wanted to move my background, I could unlock it. And now I can move the whole background. Typically not what you want to do, but that's how you would go about it. Let's say I want to take this window and use it to neutralize this bright window over on this side. So I can grab that layer and move it across. Now, by default, you aren't going to have those transform tools. So this window doesn't fit. Let's make it fit. So you want to check this box, show transform tools. Any of you that have used Photoshop for any amount of time probably have had this box checked for years. But for those of you that literally just installed Photoshop, check the box. And now it gives you these handles. So these are your resizing handles. And so I can click and drag that out. And now I've got a wider window. So that's pretty straightforward. And you can see it modified the toolbar to give me the numerical values for those transformations. So that's not what I want. How do I fit this into this space? I need to mirror it. So the quickest way to mirror this is just going to the width, and I'm going to make it negative 100%. Boom, mirrored. Okay, that's getting closer. It's almost there, but it's not quite tall enough. So we can make it taller right here numerically, or I can click and drag. But let's say I want to keep this aspect ratio the same. I can use this button right here to link the two pieces, and that's going to lock my aspect ratio. So when I make this 104%, the height also becomes 104%. There we go. That's a better fit. That mostly works. We're almost there. So some other things I want to point out before I finish up with this. So with the transform controls, so you can grab the resizing handles and just resize however you like. You can see the aspect ratio is locked right now, but if I were to unlock that, then you can see I can just change one dimension. Now, let's say I don't want to change just one dimension. Say when I'm on the corner, I can hold down Shift and drag, and you can see that's locking the aspect ratio for this operation while I'm holding down Shift. If I let go of Shift, you can see that same change allows me freedom along both dimensions. So that's helpful. Rotation is also available. Instead of putting your cursor right on the handle, put it just outside the handle, and you can get rotation. And the last thing, and this is what I actually find the most useful out of all of this, is if you hold Control, it actually gives you skew. So you can distort the shape of this window. So you can make it better fit that space by distorting it, or make it totally not fit. So those are your free transform controls. And that's how you can take beams of light or objects in your space and modify them to fit the perspective in a different location. Okay. Just need to undo all of that. All right, I'm happy with the placement of that window now. So let's go ahead and zoom back out with Control-0. Still seems out of place. So let's modify that with a layer, with an adjustment layer specifically. So I'm going to click on this window layer, and I want to go to adjustments, and it's not bright enough. So let's try brightness. Okay, so I'm just going to boost the brightness up. What's happening here? Zoom back out. Why am I brightening the whole image? That's because I don't have that window selected. Just because the window is the only thing on that layer doesn't mean the adjustment layer only affects the window. It affects everything below it. So let's come back and just affect the window. So I want to undo this brightness change. Cool. So I want to just change the brightness of this window because I moved it across the room and it's out of place now. Okay. So how about just the magic wand tool? Cool. Looks like I selected the window, right? Wrong. I actually clicked outside the window. So what I've actually selected is everything but the window. That's easy to fix. We'll just select inverse. Now I just have the window. So let's go back to the adjustment, brightness, and bring that brightness up. Now the window looks pretty natural. Cool. Let's leave it at that. So those are your transform tools, and that's one of the quickest ways to take what's existing in your image and modify it to suit a different location. Okay, color picker. I'm sure you're all familiar with the color picker, but just to be sure, it's down here. You have a primary and secondary color. There are different tools like the gradient tool that make use of both of those colors. Right here is your default, your default colors, which is just black and white. So let's say we selected this carpet. Cool. It's not a very good red. Oh, you know what the problem is? I didn't have the background layer selected, and therefore I'm selecting on an basically empty layer because the only thing there was the window. Okay, let's try this again. Select the carpet. Great. So I had the background layer selected. So now I got, oh, I should probably bring that over here. So now I have the carpet selected in the color picker tool. So that'll give me my dark red. Great. So let's say you're selecting a whole series of colors and you want to save them so you can use them later. So we can go back to that dialog box, and I just want to select the button Add Swatches, or Add to Swatches, sorry. We can name this Carpet. Let it load. Sorry, it's really grinds my computer to a halt. Okay, we made it. So to find your swatches, it's going to be in the panel over here. You see color and swatches. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can see your swatches right here. So there's your swatches there in your libraries. And then here's your color swatches right here under the swatches tab. So let's say we go back to the default black and white. So we can click this black and white button. You can see my primary secondary again have reverted to black and white. But I want to select that same red that I was using earlier. Well, the color picker tool will allow you to actually sample the swatch directly, so you can easily recall that and put that back on your primary color. If you want to switch your primary and secondary color, that's super easy. It's this button right here. That corner arrow swaps your primary and secondary colors. There's a variety of reasons you might do that because it changes the direction of a gradient. Or if you're just using something simple like a paint bucket tool, it's going to use just the primary color, and so it gives you two colors you can swap back and forth between quickly. So speaking of gradients, let's go ahead and take a look at the gradient tool. And I'm going to use it right here on the stairs because what I want to do is add some lighting underneath the lip of the stairs to highlight those steps. So first off, let's pick an appropriate color. Find a yellow, pale yellow. This is kind of like warm white light. You can pick a little better color for your projects, but for now we'll just go with this. So great. So now I have this yellowish white and white. So let's add a gradient underneath these stairs. The first step is to select those stairs, and I want to go back to my layers. There they are. Make sure I have the background selected. And let's make a new layer. We'll call this step lights. So I'll select that first stair. That looks pretty good. We'll use the subtract selection. Get that edge just so. There we go. Now we've got that stair step, or rather the back of the stair. So let's add a gradient to it. So over here, you've got your gradient tool. Select the gradient tool, and there's a couple important pieces here. So first off is the shape of the gradient. So the default shape in this case is fine because we're doing just a linear gradient. There's a lot of times you would use the circular gradient for spotlight type effects. So there's your radial gradient. And also you can have a reflected gradient. So if you're trying to represent a beam of light, that's probably the gradient you're going to want to utilize for that. So your gradient shape is important. And then you want to modify the gradient itself. So let's go into the gradient editor. And by default, it's going to use the primary and secondary colors that you have down here. But I was playing with this earlier. So let's go ahead and select that specific color there. And let's select the white there. Now, up here, I have opacity options, and you can also change where the gradient is located, but we're keeping it simple for right now. So up here, I have my opacity options. So I'll set the top of the gradient to 75% opacity, fading out to nothing, right? So this will show the gradient of light underneath that stair step. So I'm on my step lights layer. I have this section selected that I'm interested in. The gradient tool is active. So let's go ahead and add a gradient. Cool. That looks pretty good. Let's do it again. You can see I didn't quite get that edge correct. So let's go ahead and line that up. You can see it gives you the alignment tools so you can get the exact same dimensions down there. We'll add a gradient to this step as well. As you can see, doing this with a mouse is so. It's much better with a touch screen. Wow, how did I get that far off? There we go. And we'll do the last gradient down here. Clean that edge up.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is there any way that you can draw like the straight lines like what you did in AutoCAD? Like if you press the F8, then you will just draw straight lines because it's pretty hard here to, draw very straight lines here as you maybe must have with the gradients.
Yeah.
As
Yeah,
this,
it's far easier with a pen, honestly.
okay.
But you can also see the straight line. So let's zoom in to take a closer look at that. So if I'm wanting to make sure my gradient is straight, you can zoom in and you can easily see the line going jagged as you get off of straight. So it's fairly visually obvious, though it may not be that clear over zoom. On my end, it's fairly clear when I'm slightly off of straight because the line is crooked, and you can see the pixelation in the line. And now I've applied a gradient to the entire show. Well, that's not what I wanted. Cool. Okay, so now we have the under stair lighting. Not a huge fan of the gradient I ended up picking, so definitely that gradient could use some modification. But you have the information and the tools necessary to do so on your own now. So blur tool, and text tool, and then I will quit talking at you and let you all play with it yourselves. So the blur tool is especially useful for softening these hard edges that I've created here. So here's the blur tool right there, that drop. So first stop is the size, like how much blurring I want, and the hardness. So the size is going to be how much area you're covering with that. So that's a lot of area. So let's make this smaller because these stairs are pretty small in this image. And the hardness is the intensity of the blurring. So you can see a nice softening of the edge there. So let's try that again with the hardness all the way up, just to show the other extreme end. And you can see the blurring is a lot more intense more quickly. Similarly, the strength can be utilized for a similar impact. And the last thing I want to point out is the sample all layers. And so this is going to depend on the type of blur. For example, so down here for this light source, I'm not going to want to sample all layers because you can see now the pews are leaking into my step lights, and that's not what I was hoping for. So that's not the kind of blurring. Now the lights are just softening on the edge. But if we go back up to that window, so you can see I have an edge here that's a bit pixelated, right? Because there's a bit of the old and a bit of the new. This is a case where I do want to sample all layers because I'm trying to blend the layers together. So I'll just check this sample all layers box, and you can see that it's going to clean up that edge for me nicely. If I want to make that a little more, oh, that hardness is all the way up, isn't it? Okay. So that can help obscure those lines and make it less obvious that you've been playing around with it. And then finally, the text tool. The text tool is exactly what you think it is. So here it is, the text tool. So the text is going to, by default, take your primary color from your swatches down there. You actually don't want to use the color picker for the text tool because you can see I need to highlight this text. So I need to highlight this text to change its color. The better way to do it is actually up here. I can change the color. And let's move that out of the way. And you can see the actual color of the text changing as opposed to the inverted color of the text changing. Oh, let's just make that straight black. Okay. So I can use the move tool to place this where I want. And the other aspect of the text tool that I think is really important that some people don't realize is easily available. This button right here is actually going the character panel. And so there's a variety of useful things here. So, obviously you can change the font, but that's really not the point. Okay. Do not change the font on me. Sorry, Zoom and Photoshop are really good friends. Okay, there we go. So I'll open the character panel again. So you can change the font, you can change the font size. But what I actually find more helpful here is here's your line spacing options. So let's say I want to make that more compact, so I can reduce the line spacing. Sorry, I need to select that to do so. So I can reduce the line spacing to tighten that up. Oh, sorry, that's the kerning, actually. Here's the line spacing. So there, now I've tightened up the lines. And if I want to tighten up the character spacing, I can do that here. So that'll reduce the distance between each character. These are just stretches, which works the same as a transformation. And you can change the color. And here's all of your basic text modifiers. So you can make that text bold or italicized or all of the above, superscripted, strike through, underline, etc. So the character panel there is helpful because it includes all of your basic text modifications you might expect. Okay, so that is my introduction to Photoshop.